A frontier family in 1780 slaughtered one hog in December and ate from that single animal for the next 12 months. No freezer, no refrigerator, no electricity of any kind. And the meat did not rot. It did not poison them. It fed them through summer, through the following harvest, and sometimes into the year after that. What they knew about food preservation was not luck or guesswork. It was a complete engineered system, and most of it has been quietly forgotten. Before we get into the methods, you need to understand the stakes. These families were not hobbyists experimenting on weekends. They were operating on a zero-margin system where a failed preservation run could mean genuine hunger by March. Every technique they used was refined over generations, tested through failure, and passed down with the same seriousness that a tradesman passes down how to read a load. This was not folk craft. This was applied food engineering, and it worked reliably for centuries across multiple continents. The entire system rests on 4 engineering principles. Remove water, load the environment with salt or acid, cut off oxygen, lower the temperature. Every single method frontier families used was hitting one or more of those 4 targets. Dry curing attacks water activity. Brining floods the environment with salt that bacteria cannot survive in. Potting meat in rendered fat physically blocks oxygen. Root cellars and spring houses pull the temperature down to slow microbial growth. Once you understand those 4 levers, every technique they used starts making complete sense. Salt was not a seasoning to these families. It was infrastructure. Mid-sized farm households in the 1860s were buying 200 to 500 pounds of salt per year, and the bulk of that went straight into meat preservation. Frontier families in Kentucky and Virginia would haul barrels of salt along specific trade routes from regional salt works, the same way we think about hauling fuel today. Salt springs and salt licks were strategically important enough that early frontier communities fought over access to them. If your salt supply failed, your meat supply failed. It was that direct. The timing of the slaughter was itself a preservation technique. Hogs and cattle were killed in late fall or early winter when nighttime temperatures stayed reliably cold. That cold air was doing real work. It chilled the carcass quickly, slowing the bacterial growth that begins the moment an animal dies. This natural refrigeration window gave the family time to butcher, portion, and begin curing before spoilage could get a foothold. They were using the season as a tool, the same way a builder uses the landscape instead of fighting it. Dry curing was the workhorse method for hams and bacon. The formula was roughly 1/2 pound to 1 pound of salt per 10 pounds of meat, rubbed deep into the surface and packed around the cuts. Sugar was often added to balance flavor and help draw moisture. Sometimes saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, was mixed in as well, which inhibits certain dangerous bacteria and gives cured ham that characteristic pink color. The cure was applied over 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the size of the cut and how cold the curing room was. Thicker cuts needed more time because the salt had to migrate all the way to the center. The smokehouse was not just a flavor device, it was a chemical preservation system. And here's the part that surprises most people. The best smokehouses ran cold. Temperatures under 90 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At that range, the meat was not cooking, it was slowly losing moisture while absorbing phenolic compounds from the wood smoke. Those phenolics are antimicrobial and antioxidant. They attack surface bacteria and slow fat from going rancid. A properly cold smoked ham might spend days or even weeks in the smokehouse. The goal was a dry, stable surface that bacteria could not easily colonize. Brining was the method for cuts that were too awkward to dry cure easily. You pack the meat into a barrel or crock, pour in a heavy salt brine, weigh the meat down so it stays submerged, and move it to the coolest place you have. A Virginia farm family in 1770 might put brine pork into covered casks in their root cellar in December and pull from that barrel through the summer. The brine concentration had to be high enough that bacteria could not survive in it. They tested this with a raw potato or egg. If it floated, the brine was strong enough. That is empirical quality control, no lab required. Potted meat under fat is the technique that genuinely surprises people when they understand the mechanism. You cook the meat thoroughly, pack it tightly into a jar or crock, and then pour hot rendered lard or tallow over the top until the meat is completely covered. As the fat cools, it hardens into a solid layer. That layer is an oxygen barrier. Bacteria that cause spoilage need oxygen to thrive. You have just physically sealed them out. Colonial Williamsburg records describe this exact practice in 18th century Virginia households, and Amish families are doing the same thing today. Properly done, potted meat under lard can last 6 months or more in a cool, dry space. Now, here's a technique that gets almost no attention in mainstream history. Indigenous peoples across North America had already solved long-term meat preservation centuries before European contact, and their solution was pemmican. Thin strips of meat were dried in the sun or wind until completely desiccated, then pulverized and mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. The result was packed into rawhide bags. By removing nearly all moisture and then encasing the dried meat in fat to block oxygen, they created a product that could last months and sometimes years. The Hudson's Bay Company was moving tens of thousands of pounds of pemmican as rations for fur brigades by the late 1700s. This was not wilderness improvisation. This was industrial-scale food engineering. The pemmican supply became so strategically critical that it triggered an actual war. The Pemmican Wars of 1814 to 1821 in what is now Manitoba were a direct conflict between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company over control of pemmican supply routes. Settlements were burned, trade routes were blockaded, people died over dried meat in rawhide bags. That tells you everything you need to know about how seriously pre-industrial societies took long-term meat preservation. It was not a hobby, it was a strategic resource with the same weight as fuel or ammunition. Jerky and biltong-style dried meats followed the same core logic as pemmican, but without the fat encasing. The key variables were meat thickness, salt concentration, airflow, and humidity. In the arid western United States, where relative humidity can drop below 20%, thin salted strips of meat hung in open air could reach a stable low moisture state within days. At that moisture level, bacteria simply cannot reproduce. But here is the counterintuitive storage rule that trips people up. Very dry meat must not be sealed in airtight containers. Sealing traps any residual moisture, creates condensation, and invites mold. Frontier families stored jerky in cloth bags or open sacks, which sounds less sanitary but was actually the correct engineering choice. Winter air itself was used as a free walk-in freezer, and this technique had its own engineering rules. Amish families, continuing practices that go back well before electrification, would hang prepared meat outdoors in freezing weather for weeks or even months. But they learned that exposed meat damaged by snow or rain would spoil faster than meat kept indoors. The solution was breathable covers, burlap, or similar open weave cloth that kept precipitation off while still allowing cold air to circulate. The goal was dry cold, not wet cold. That distinction between dry freezing and wet freezing is the difference between meat that keeps and meat that rots. The mason jar changed the game when it was patented in 1858, but widespread safe home pressure canning of meat did not become standard until the early 20th century. Before pressure canning, Home canning carried real risk because boiling water alone does not reach temperatures high enough to kill Clostridium botulinum spores in low-acid foods like meat. Frontier families who canned meat before pressure canners were widely available were taking a genuine gamble. The pressure canner closed that gap by pushing temperatures above 240 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to destroy those spores. Properly pressure canned meat in glass jars was then considered safe for 1 to 3 years or more. Here is the misconception worth addressing directly. People assume frontier families were eating half-rotten meat and just tolerating it because they had no choice. That is completely backwards. They invested enormous effort in avoiding rot. The timing of the slaughter, the weight of the salt, the weeks in the smokehouse, the depth of the fat seal, all of it was designed to prevent spoilage, not mask it. Meat that genuinely rotted was fed to dogs or discarded. The goal was always to carry good quality calories forward through time, and the methods they used were capable of doing exactly that when applied correctly. Step back and look at what a single well-managed winter butchering actually produced. One hog at 200 to 300 pounds live weight yielded roughly 120 to 180 pounds of usable meat and fat. That fat became lard for cooking and for sealing potted meat. The hams and shoulders went into the smokehouse. The belly became bacon. The scraps became sausage. The rendered lard became the preservation medium for cooked cuts. Nothing was wasted, and every part of the animal was converted into a different preservation format with a different shelf life. They solved this centuries ago. The question is why we forgot. What makes all of this worth studying in 2026 is not nostalgia. It is that the engineering is still valid. Salt still pulls water out of meat. Cold smoke still deposits antimicrobial phenolics on a surface. Rendered fat still creates an oxygen barrier. A root cellar still holds a steady, cool temperature without a single watt of power. These are not historical curiosities. They are functional systems that operated reliably for centuries, and that Amish communities are still running today without electric freezers. The knowledge did not become obsolete. We just stopped teaching it when the freezer arrived and made it feel unnecessary. If you want to go deeper on any of these methods, the next video in this series breaks down how to build a functional cold smokehouse from materials you can source on a rural property, including the airflow geometry that keeps temperatures in the right range without constant monitoring. If this one gave you something useful, hit subscribe, because that is exactly the kind of content this channel runs every week. Practical knowledge, real engineering, no filler. I will see you in the next one.